If you're being faced with signing a publishing contract for your creative work, or you hope to be someday, be sure to listen to this episode of Deconstructing Comics. Katie Lane, an attorney who helps creators negotiate publishing contracts, is here to talk about the potential pitfalls in publishing contracts and how to avoid them. First, I'd like to thank our patrons for keeping this show going. Join them at patreon.com/deconcomics. If Patreon isn't in your budget, you can also send a one-time donation of any amount via PayPal to donate@deconstructingcomics.com. We appreciate your support. This is Tim, and this is Deconstructing Comics. Okay, I'm talking with Katie Lane in Portland. How are you doing?
I'm doing really well. How are you?
Okay. Are you originally from Portland?
I am not. I usually tell people I'm originally from the Army. My dad was in the military until I was about 13, so we lived all over the place, but I ended up in Portland after going to law school up here, and I just never left.
Okay. Now, this interview, you don't realize how long this has been in the pipeline, because, last July, I was on a trip to various places around the country, visiting friends and recording podcasts. And my first stop was Minneapolis. And somebody there, while I was talking with them for the podcast, says, when you're in Portland, you should talk to Katie Lane, because she's a lawyer and she works with creators and, on comics and stuff, when they're doing contracts. And so I got this in the recording, and then I was thinking, well, when I edit this later, I'll remember to do this. Well, I didn't actually end up editing it until I was back in Japan.
I'm familiar with that, yeah.
I was in Portland and I completely forgot about contacting her. So, and then, I kept having enough content, and we had conventions here that I covered, and I have other contributors who were sending me stuff, and it was always kind of on the list. And then finally, okay, I need some content. I'm going to contact Katie Lane. So here we finally are.
Ta-da!
Okay, so now you, as I just said, you are a lawyer who works with creators, not just comics, right? Other kinds of creators also?
Yeah, I work with pretty much anybody who is working for themselves in some sort of creative capacity. So a lot of designers, authors, a couple folks who compose music for video games, some game designers. So lots of really interesting people doing really interesting things. But primarily I'm helping them with their contracts that they're signing for the work that they do. And then also helping them make sure that they understand how to protect their intellectual property rights. But I got into lawyering. I got into lawyering intentionally to work with artists, but when I started this practice, I started working with a lot of comics folks. So my experience with comics publishing agreements and the collaboration agreements that can be helpful for managing a project it's probably where the depth of my experience is.
Okay. When I first heard about you, I thought, well, she must be in Portland because it's such a comics town, but apparently it's more of a coincidence.
It is kind of a coincidence. Yeah, I came up to Portland for law school and liked it a whole bunch. Not at first, but eventually. And eventually just sort of stuck around and started, as you do, making friends and meeting more and more people in the comics community.
Okay. Now, have you ever done any kind of creative work yourself?
Yeah, actually, I when I was younger, I was in theater, and so I did a bunch of acting, and it was the first thing that led me to thinking about the possibility of law school, actually, because I would see the theater that I worked for. It was a small nonprofit regional theater. Lots of really good people doing really good work, but I saw that it could be hard sometimes to get business advice that made sense for a creative company. it was really easy to get business advice or guidance that sort of was generically good for a small business, but it was harder to get that niche advice. And so when I started thinking what I would do when I grew up, going to law school was one of those things. And I thought I could use my experience as a creator and as a creative person and learn more about the business and the legal side, and maybe find a better way of explaining how those things apply to a creative business.
Okay. Now, what percentage of your business is comics related?
That's a good question. People ask me all the time, and I should probably just crunch the numbers. I get the sense that maybe close to half of it is, which is actually a pretty big percentage, because I think it is the largest percentage of the work that I do that's consistent. I think the remaining amount of my work is divided up again amongst a lot of different industries or approaches.
Okay. So if it's not the majority, it's certainly the plurality of
exactly
your work. Okay. Now, when you do comics work, is that primarily like graphic novels, or are there like monthly issue type work of contracts? Maybe some, what I want to say, work for hire stuff, or kind of mixed in?
It's kind of a mix of things. It depends, right? Like, because it's going to depend on the project that the creative team has, and who's making up that creative team, and how they came to be working together, and what publisher they're bringing it to, and how they're pitching it to that publisher. So it can be, a lot of times it is a graphic novel where it is a complete story. Other times it is they've mapped out the arc of what they would like to be able to tell through issues. But if there's the possibility of going longer, they definitely take it. So it just kind of depends on the project. And I like that about comics. I like that you can make decisions based on what's best for the story, and what's best for the team that is creating that story, and that you can also be a little bit flexible and respond. So, if you end up having to end a title earlier than you really wanted to, you can. If you can make it go longer, you can. If somebody needs to be replaced, that's also an option. It's not, you're not, I get the sense from the outside, obviously not making the comic, but there's a little bit more flexibility than in some other storytelling.
Yeah, okay. I listened to another interview with you on another podcast, and you mentioned a lot that there were, like, often people who were doing comics were given contracts that applied more to, or were more suited to, other kinds of books rather
definitely.
than comics. So, like, what kind of differences are there between what would be an appropriate contract for a comic versus some other kind of like prose book?
I see that happening most often when it's a graphic novel that one of the larger publishers has bought. So they're going to be publishing, it's Macmillan or Scholastic or somebody, where they're going to be publishing a graphic novel, but graphic novels aren't all of the types of books that they publish, and their contracts are written to be easily applicable to all of the different types of books that they might publish. And because most of them are prose based, a lot of the things like delivery schedules are written purely in terms of prose. So it talks a lot about the manuscript. It talks a lot about turnaround on revisions based on how long it would take to do written revisions versus how long it might take to incorporate revisions to drawing. The other thing is that with comics, there are a lot more touch points editorially, or there can be a lot more touch points editorially, so that you're looking at things at a thumbnail stage, at a penciling stage. You're able to consult with your editor on inking and coloring choices that might impact the story. So the editor actually has a lot more, has more opportunities to engage with those stories. But the contract doesn't always consider that. The other thing is that a lot of times in large publishing agreements or from large publishing houses, they'll have a requirement that this next book is the next book that is published by the creator. And with prose, that can sometimes work because generally, they've bought the book based on a treatment, and now you're going to sit down and you're going to write it, and that's going to be the next book that comes out. With comics, you can have so many different projects going on at the same time, and the publishing schedule can differ so greatly depending on, lots of different factors. The agreement that you're signing today could be the next book that comes out under your name, or it could be, the third book that comes out under your name. And so it's not as aware of some of the differences that comics creators face in how they are filling their plate with work.
Yeah, the creator might not even have any control over whether it's their next book or not.
Yeah, and especially for writers, right? Like, as a comics writer, if you're not writing and drawing, if you're purely writing, you need to have a lot of projects in your in your queue to really make sure that you have enough work. And if you make a promise that limits your ability to take on new work, or if you make a promise that limits your ability to release work into the world, that can be really detrimental and not necessarily helpful for the publisher, right? Because part of the reason that they're hiring you is they think, oh, you've got this fan base and those people are going to want to buy this book because they're going to see your name. Well, if you, as the publisher, are limiting that person, that writer, from being able to get more things out into the world and out to their fans, it's going to have a negative impact on how fans end up responding by the time this publisher's book comes out. So it's little things that are different about how comics are made that the template agreement doesn't always consider because it wasn't written to consider those things.
Yeah. So if you're a comics creator and you're handed a contract that has some of those things, then what should you do? Should you try to negotiate those out, or?
Yeah, absolutely. I think some of the easiest things to negotiate in a contract are the things that don't apply. And it's fairly easy to go back to them and say, like, well, this is literally not how we have talked about how we're going to work together. It is fundamentally different from how we've talked about working together. And then I think there are other things where it is just a process of explaining why that structure doesn't work for you and why potentially it doesn't work for the publisher as well. Why? Because a lot of times people ask for terms, they ask for promises based on what they think makes sense. And if you're a comics creator and you can say, hey, in this industry, this term just doesn't make sense, it's helpful to the publisher to know that, and it does make it easier to negotiate that term, because you're not just saying, I want this thing because. You're saying, I want this thing because it is going to be beneficial for our relationship, it's going to be beneficial for this book's release, it's going to be beneficial for you in sales, it's going to be beneficial for me in my career, it's going to be more, it's going to fit in with industry norms. Those types of arguments as to why you would change something are pretty darn compelling, so you might as well use it when you can. Yeah,
or that it's out of my hands whether this is my next book or not, because some other publisher's schedule, I can't do anything about it.
Exactly.
Yeah, so if for example, if I were a comics creator, or better at it than I have been, and somebody wanted to publish my work, I was handed a contract, or I was anyway talking with a publisher. So what are some common mistakes that people in that situation make?
I think the biggest mistake, and it's also the easiest mistake to make, it's the one that I completely understand and empathize with. It's thinking this is the only contract you will ever see, and that this is the only offer you will ever get. And so you have to put up with things that you don't like in order to get the ultimate goal of having your comic publish. And so I think sometimes just that approach to looking at the agreement can be detrimental. But the things that I tell people to think about are make sure that you're giving the publisher the rights that you want to give them. Make sure those are rights that the publisher can use effectively. You never want to give somebody rights that they don't have the ability to act on. So for instance, if it's a small press and it's relatively new and they're asking you for the right to publish the comic in all languages, all over the world. If they don't have any experience doing foreign rights deals, which are the deals to translate your comic into a foreign language and sell those comics in other places, they can't make use of those rights very effectively. You giving those rights to them means that you can't do it yourself, or maybe potentially work with an agent who can help you place those rights. So,
yeah, and then maybe they won't ever get published in other languages because it's tied up with this company that can't actually do it.
Exactly, and that company might be really good at publishing your book in English and selling it in North America, but if they have more than what they can effectively use, you are in a position of not being able to make use of those rights, and that's not particularly helpful. So really looking at those things and understanding, what is this publisher good at doing? What do they have experience doing? Why am I interested in working with this publisher in the first place? The other thing is I feel very strongly that if you're publishing a creator-generated work, it's something that you've been working on and you're coming with an original pitch to a publisher, that should always be a situation where you are licensing the rights, which means you retain ownership of the copyright and you're just giving the publisher the ability to publish the book. You might be licensing them several different types of rights, but you are giving them permission while you retain ownership of the copyright. Versus if you're doing a book where you're getting to play with somebody else's toys, you're getting to write Batman, or you're getting to do an X-Men arc, then that's where work for hire makes sense. Because you're coming in to a universe that already exists, where there's already a lot of intellectual property, and you're getting the opportunity to play with those toys. That's literally how I think of it. And so in those instances, work for hire makes sense. But I don't think work for hire makes sense in a situation where it is an original story that you have worked on, that you're bringing to the publisher, and they're just going to publish for you. Because what work for hire means, from a legal standpoint, is that the copyright belongs to the publisher or whomever you're contracting with from the very beginning of its creation. So as soon as you start creating that comic, it belongs to the publisher. And in order for you to be able to use that comic, you're going to have to get permission from the publisher now. And that, in a original story situation, that just doesn't make sense to me.
Now, talking to some other people, I guess sometimes there will be a contract that says, like, it'll say you retain the copyright, but kind of at the same time they'll say kind of you don't, because
I've read those contracts. I'm familiar.
Will we retain the right to publish it for the lifetime of the contract, or some words to that effect. Back in the Critiquing Comics 132 a couple months ago, Mulele was talking about a contract that a friend of ours had been offered by a company that's based in Japan but operated by non-Japanese people. Okay. And the wording that I actually transcribed it from what he read in the podcast. You retain the rights, but nonetheless, quoting, by submitting, uploading, posting, or displaying content through our services, you hereby grant the company a worldwide, perpetual, irrevocable, non-exclusive, royalty-free, and fully paid-up license, with the right to sub-license at multiple levels to use, copy, reproduce, process, adapt, modify, edit, publish, publicly display, transmit, and distribute your content in whole or in part, in any and all forms of media, and by any and all method of distribution and transmission now known or later developed.
Is that it? Yeah, those are so one of the things I try to help people understand when they're running into really ridiculous terms like that is that one of the things that law school blesses you with is a generalized anxiety disorder. Because they spend 3 years telling you that you have to make sure that you get everything right every time you do it. And if anything is wrong in how you've drafted a contract and, your client ends up losing out, that's your fault, and that's horrible, and maybe you'll lose your license. So a lot of times what you'll see are lawyers overdrafting, so that's a good example, what you just read, where they're writing more than they actually have to, and then what happens is I see that in an agreement that I'm reviewing, and I'm also anxious, and I have to write something similar, so I take that language, and I replicate it, and then culturally within a particular industry like publishing or entertainment law, we start seeing that language over and over and over again, and then as it goes through more lawyers who are worried like, well, wait a second, does this have everything it needs? I'm going to add a couple more words in there. They'll add to it. And so as you're reading that, I understand what each of those words mean and why they're there and how they're differentiating the license, but it's not particularly helpful, right? Like you, as the person granting permission, you're not reading that and understanding what you're doing or why you're doing it. One of the things to always look for in a license, in that soup of words, is whether or not your license is, the permission that you're granting the other party, is exclusive or non-exclusive. Granting an exclusive license means that only that party will be able to use those rights for as long as the license lasts. A publishing agreement is actually a really good example of that. Publishing licenses typically are exclusive, and that's because the publisher doesn't want you publishing a book to compete with the book that they're putting out, right? They don't want you going somewhere else and having somebody else publish the exact same book, and so when I go to the store, I have to decide amongst the 3 different versions and which one I buy. So in an exclusive licensing relationship, only that licensee, only that person with the permission can use that right. In a non-exclusive relationship, you can use that right, and I can give that right to somebody else, and then I can use it myself. So a non-exclusive license is much less limiting to the owner, because you can continue to use that right, and others can continue to use, and you can give it the permission to other people as well. And in what you find oftentimes in online platforms where you're uploading things is they ask for these huge, expansive, royalty-free, perpetual, irrevocable, yada, 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 non-exclusive licenses to reproduce and display. And it's basically they're asking for a license so that the internet works. Because they know that they're going to be displaying your artwork on their platform. They know that they're going to be copying those files on their servers. They know that they're going to be transmitting that information all over the place. And what they're trying to do with those really ridiculous licenses are get the permission that they need to be able to do those things. But when you read them like a normal human being, they certainly don't sound like they're just a license to make the internet work.
Yeah. Now, the one that I just read, it did have non-exclusive, right? But so, yeah, okay, that's a different way to look at it. Just because it's out there on the internet and anybody can see it, and you don't know what's going to happen to it, right?
Yeah, and the way that we transmit data is it requires copying, it requires displaying, it requires publishing at various points and for various reasons. And because those are the rights that copyright controls, the license wants to be really, really clear. Like, hey, I can do all of these things because I need to do all of these things for, this page of the comic to appear on my platform so that users can read it.
Okay. Yeah, actually, that I mentioned that was a Japan-based company run by non-Japanese. Another kind of odd thing in it was that it said if there's a dispute and we can't work it out within 60 days, it'll go to court in New York.
Ah, okay.
Apparently, it was only written in English, which makes it not a binding contract in Japan.
Yeah, I would guess not.
So it seems to be an American contract.
Yeah, no, and I'm guessing it also says that if you needed to interpret the contract, you would interpret it applying the law from the state of New York. And so
probably
what that means, that's governing law is usually what that's called in a contract, and that's just telling the judge, like, hey, if there's a dispute regarding this contract, apply the case law from this particular state to figure out what to do. And then the reason why you want to say where the lawsuit would happen is because generally you are picking a place, if you're the contract drafter, if you're the company that's writing the contract, you're picking a place that's close for you, that's inexpensive for you. So my guess is maybe they have like a small office in New York, or maybe even their lawyers are based in New York. And so it's easier for them if all lawsuits happen exactly where their lawyers are.
Yeah, it's kind of a disadvantage for the Tokyo-based creator, though.
Yeah, totally. Well, and that's the thing. Sometimes you can get those changed. Sometimes you can just get that stuff removed from the contract. But what I always tell when I get to talk to a lawyer on the other side, what I always tell them is I totally understand why you have this in here. I just want you to know this makes your company look unreasonable to the people that you're trying to attract. They are looking at this and wondering if the company really knows what it's doing, because it seems so out of the ordinary. And sometimes the lawyers are like, yeah, I totally get that, but this is what we're doing. And other times they're just like, well, why would anybody think that? Because this is how contracts work. And that's, I find that to be just a very interesting approach, because contracts are more often read by non-lawyers than they are lawyers, I think.
Yeah, I mean, it kind of makes me wonder, just occurred to me now, that perhaps these New York-based lawyers for the company put all this together, and the people who are actually here in Tokyo don't even quite get what's in the contract themselves.
Oh, yeah. I see that happening all the time. And it can be really... I try to, whenever I'm drafting a contract for somebody, I try to make it very approachable, not only in the language that I use, but also in how I help them ask me questions about it. So I make it really clear that any question is fine, ask all the questions you want, because I've had situations where clients, they trust me, they trust my advice, so they assume they don't understand it, but I wrote it, so it's fine. Why would I write something bad? And it's not that I would write something bad, it's just that if I'm writing something based on what's normal to me, but it's not normal to your industry, that's not good language for you. It doesn't necessarily mean that I had a bad intent. It just means I didn't fully understand what your industry was like and what its norms were. So I think it's very common to see situations where the company or the people who are heading up the company don't entirely understand all of the terms. They understand most of them, but maybe there are a couple that are still, they just assume, hey, my lawyer did it, it's fine.
Yeah, I can imagine feeling that way myself if I were in that situation.
Totally.
I trust my lawyer, so
yeah.
I don't know what's in it. Just this legal stuff. Now, our friend Stephen Bissett has, he teaches at the Center for Cartoon Studies, and so his students get a lot of contracts, maybe they're graduates, and some of them, that he's seen just kind of outraged him. There have been quite a few where the creator has to, sign over rights to the publisher, even if the publisher decides not to publish it.
Yeah, that's dumb.
Yeah, And when I asked him for some things to ask you, one thing he pointed out was publishers in the contracts where publishers are not obligated to even publish the completed work contracted for, but if the creator wants to get the rights back, they have to reimburse the publisher for all costs, not just the advance paid to the creator, but all costs.
Yeah, no, it's maddening, right? Like,
yeah,
you think through the practicalities of it, and you're like, why would you ever write it this way? But yeah, so very few publishing agreements will make a promise that the book will get published. Some of them will say, if it's not published within a certain period of time after it's turned in, the rights will revert to you, or you have the opportunity for the rights to revert to you. But because publishers are usually buying on a pitch rather than the completed product, very rarely will they promise at that point in time, yeah, we're definitely going to super duper publish this. They'll usually promise that, that's our intent, and once you turn it in, we have a certain amount of time to publish it, but it's rare that you would see a specific promise of publishing. But the other situation where you're talking about, like, okay, so the rights are going to revert to you, but before they revert to you, you have to reimburse the publisher for their costs, which maybe you're thinking, well, they didn't give me a very hefty advance, so it's not going to be that big a deal. I kept it in the bank, and I'll just turn it back over to them. Depending on what your contract says, though, you might have to pay them for the overhead. The editor that the time that the editor spent on the book, or any purchasing that they did of materials or marketing. So you want to look at that and think through, okay, when would that be reasonable? And maybe that might be reasonable if you just totally flake out on the project. You stop turning things in. You don't do the work that was required of you. You decide that this is not a story you're interested in anymore. You're not going to do it. So maybe that makes sense that you would reimburse them. But if they just decide not to publish, man, you rolled the dice. That was your risk. I don't have to pay you for taking a risk. That's ridiculous. So I usually try to look at those things and make sure that, like, if there's language like that, it's really limited to situations where the creator has intentionally done something that is going to cause the publisher harm. But if the publisher is just making a decision, like, I'm sorry, like, I get it. Everybody's margins are tight, but no, if you decide not to publish, that's your loss.
Yeah, like, well, we're not going to publish it. Pay up.
No. Yeah, I hate that. It's really very frustrating.
Coming up, signing over media rights, preemptive submission agreements, and more. What if you've already signed a bad contract? What can you do? When might you sign a bad deal intentionally? Should you get a lawyer or an agent or both? Finding and affording a lawyer and one who actually knows publishing, and more. First, just a reminder that you can help this podcast by making your Amazon purchases via deconstructingcomics.com/Amazon and make that your bookmark for future purchases. We'll then get a percentage of what you spend. It costs you nothing extra and helps us cover web hosting and the other costs of presenting this show every week. We really appreciate your support.
This is an imaginary podcast, which may never have happened.
The Shortbox Showcase.
But then again may have. About a father and daughter. I'm Professor Allen.
And I'm Emily.
Who came from Ohio and talked about comics.
Walking Dead.
Tintin.
Black Lightning.
White Tiger. It tells of their rise to glory, when the great guests were yet to be booked.
Let's put it this way, Shogun Warriors wasn't going to win any Eisners.
And the great feats of editing not yet performed.
This is Ultra 7, this is Ultraman Jack, and this Ultraman Taro, and this Ultraman Leo, and this
of how they spoke at length.
This continuity is really the brainchild of nitpicking nerds the world over.
But to be fair, the best kind of confession is the Force confession.
And reviewed in brief tales that explore creatively the bounds of a given character's history.
Red Sun is wonderful with a very strange ending.
Of brilliant creators before their fall from grace. This is the era where Miller is at the height of his creative and artistic powers, and the ability of strong writing to encapsulate and transcend its time.
Flash of Two Earths by Gardner Fox.
This is an imaginary podcast. Aren't they all? Shortbox Showcase is part of the Relatively Geeky family of podcasts. Check us out on the web at relativelygeekypodcast.blogspot.com or search in iTunes for Relatively Geeky or Shortbox Showcase. And remember, we're not experts.
We're just family.
Another thing that he pointed out was sometimes the contracts want you to sign over your media rights for all media. So, what advice would you have for creators about retaining those other media rights? And what are we talking about here exactly? Media rights.
That's a really good question. So usually when we're talking about media rights, we're talking about film and television rights and anything that could be related to that film and television. So
video game,
merchandise, yeah. And now what you're seeing more and more are the media rights are more expansive. So it's film, television, a video game that's based on the comic versus a video game that's based on the television show. I know that sounds like that's there's no difference.
Splitting hairs, yeah.
From a copyright law perspective, they're very different things. So, a lot of times now you're seeing it's television, film, video games, games. They're thinking of all the different things that could be based on the comic itself and trying to acquire those. There are some independent, smaller comics publishers where they are now sort of just, you get the publishing agreement, you get the media rights option, and you have to sign both in order to get the publishing agreement. I don't particularly like that. I think that's again, it goes back to, can the person you're giving these rights to make good use of them? If they can, great. If they've got a good track record, fantastic. But if it's kind of a toss-up, that you're running a risk. So I always encourage people to really talk to the editor or the publisher, whomever is offering them the terms, and say, okay, what if I sign this? What's the plan? How does this work, practically speaking? Like, are you hustling and pitching my comic as a potential television show from the get-go? Or are you waiting to see until numbers come out on sales as to whether or not you're going to include it in the pitch package? And is there a particular point in time where if you haven't used it yet, I get it back? I am much less nervous about situations where, okay, I'm signing this over to you for a couple years. I can't use it for a couple years. But eventually, if you haven't used it, it gets to come back to me. That's a much more comfortable situation to me than you get these rights forever and ever as long as you're publishing the book. Unless you're dealing with a large company that has the ability to make use of those rights, like Disney, Hyperion publishes books, and they're owned by Disney, and Disney has the ability to make use of a lot of things. Now, if Disney wants to buy those rights, they have to negotiate for them, but that's a situation where you know that there's a better potential for use than a company that is just publishing comics or just publishing, it's a small press publishing books.
Yeah, so it's basically like the same approach as the worldwide translation rights. I mean, are they going to use it, actually make use of it, or is it just going to sit there, and can you get it back at some point?
Yeah, understanding how the rights could come back to you, what are the different ways in which they could revert to you, really helps you understand how fair the contract is, I think. Because it's very normal in publishing, like, hey, if the book goes out of print, you can ask for your rights back, and we'll give them to you. No big deal. But with digital printing, or digital publishing now, what does out of print mean? We've got to define that a little bit better. And then but the other thing is that, like, okay, sure, you can try to sell the media rights for the next 3 years. Totally fine. I get it. But if you can't sell them after those 3 years, I want the ability to get them back. Now, we might get to the end of those 3 years and maybe I don't have an agent, maybe I don't have a way of making use of those rights, so I tell the publisher, you know what, have another 3 years. Like, I can't do anything with them right now, and you might be able to, so go ahead and use them again. But in that situation, it's a really limited window of time. It's very clear what they can and can't do. It's very clear how it could get back to you. That is, to me, much better for the creator than a situation where they're just signing the rights away and it's not really clear how they're going to come back, or if they come back, the creator's going to have to pay out of pocket regardless of the reason why the rights are coming back.
Now, if somebody's listening to this and they've already signed a contract and then they realize that they've signed away too much, I mean, what do they have any recourse to try to get back any rights that they've signed away?
You might. It depends. Like, spoiler, everybody has signed a bad contract. Everybody has signed a bad contract. It doesn't mean you're a bad person. It doesn't mean you're a bad creator or you're not going to be a professional. It just means you're human. Welcome to the club. But sometimes you might be able to renegotiate the terms of the deal depending on what the publisher wants to do with it. So maybe it's a title that's doing really well for them, that they're really pleased with it and they're interested in getting another book from you or another story from you, having you pitch other titles to them. Maybe one of the things that you say is, I would really love to do that, but in order to do that, I can't agree to these terms that you had me sign this last time, and I really need to revise those terms because they're not good for me, and chances are you're not even using them any longer. Because that's the other thing, is companies update their terms on a semi-regular basis, so it's possible that those old terms are not even things that they need any longer, and they'd be willing to update those for you. So think about ways in which, the other thing to look at is, okay, you sign the agreement, but the book's not doing particularly well, sales aren't particularly strong. Maybe approach the publisher and say, hey, can I get some of those rights back? Because it looks like you're not making good use of them. It looks like you would have to invest more money in order to get the sales back up. Can we make an agreement that you get to sell off your inventory, but I get to take the rights back and do something with them? That's also a possibility. The other thing to know is that it's really common or it's more common in entertainment agreements where the rights come back to you. Maybe you do have to reimburse the publisher for them, but instead of having to do that out of pocket, you can reimburse them from money that you get when you do another licensing deal. So basically, the money that the new company gives you, instead of coming into your pocket, just flows to the publisher to reimburse them. So you're not having to pay out of pocket. You're still having to pay, obviously, but you're not having to pay out of pocket, and that can make it a little bit easier, because then you can go and shop, your comic or the rights that you have, get somebody who's interested in buying them, and finance the repayment that way.
I see. Have you ever seen a contract that was just so terrible that there was no way to negotiate it and you just walk away from it?
Yes, absolutely. I see contracts all the time that make me swear or write, curse words in the margin or unhappy faces. But the thing that I always tell people is, I'm a nerd about contracts, so I'm going to have very strong opinions about things. But I'm not in the best position to know if it makes sense to agree to some less than great terms because the thing that you're getting is worthwhile. Like, maybe you're approaching this particular comic or this particular deal as a stepping stone, and you completely understand this is a crap deal, you're probably not going to make very much money off of it, but it's getting you closer to working with somebody that you wanted to work with, or it's going to have your name on something that's published and that's going to be sold through Diamond, and that's going to allow you to then pitch your next project to this other publisher that you want to work with and be that much more attractive. So it can be okay to agree to crappy contract terms as long as you are doing it intentionally. And you're doing it knowingly. You're saying, all right, I am aware that this is bad, but the thing I am getting is worth it. So I'm going to agree to it. But there have definitely been times where I've worked with a client and I'm like, this contract is the opposite of everything you told me you wanted. And in order to fix it, we would have to change something on almost every page. So we can try to do that, but it might be a better use of your time and money if you just said, no thanks, and see if you can't find a better publisher for this particular book.
Oh, another thing from Stephen Bissett. He said, what should a young freelancer do when asked to sign a preemptive submission agreement contract before their work is even looked at?
Oh my goodness. Again with the anxious lawyers. So I think it really depends on the company that you're submitting to and what their reputation is. Have they been in the industry for a while? Is this a reputable company with a bad practice? Or is this a brand new company that you've never heard of before and nobody you know has ever heard of before and they're asking you to do this thing? The other thing is look at what that preemptive agreement says. Sometimes we're seeing like more and more contests, and I put context in air quotes because they're not really contests. They're just ways for these companies to get intellectual property and to get a lot of pitches at once and to turn it into a winning situation where they're offering you less than they would have offered you in a negotiated deal. Anyway, but you're seeing these contests where you're promising ahead of time what you would agree to if they pick your project to publish. And that is not okay. It's okay to agree to like some global terms, like this would get you a publishing deal based on our standard agreement for a print run of your graphic novel. That's an okay thing to agree to, but this would grant you a publishing agreement where you'd get an advance of $10,000 and we might publish it in a digital format only available on our platform. And you're going to have to give us the media rights and the right to make stationery products based off of it and merchandise based off of it and everything else. That's not okay. They're asking you to give up a lot of negotiating power before you've even gotten to the place where you know whether or not that publishing agreement's an option for you. So I would really look at what are those terms. Are they just basically telling you like, hey, if you submit this, you understand that we might be working on something similar or we might see something similar, and that we're not infringing your work if you see something that is similar to it, because we're reviewing a lot of stories at the same time and we've got a lot of different stories in the works, and since we have no idea what you're going to submit, we might have something that is similar, and it's not necessarily that we stole your work, it's just that we were working on something at around the same time. That is uncomfortable but understandable, and as long as it's worded reasonably, I'm not as concerned by that. But if you're agreeing, yes, I submit this to you, and if you accept it, here are all of the terms that I would get, that's too much. That's not okay.
Mm-hmm. Now, the contracts that come in from the publishers, do they, well, we were talking about the ones from people who also publish prose books, but are they generally some boilerplate? Are they written from scratch? Are they patched together from different contracts? What have you seen?
So they're typically going to be a template agreement. They're going to be a boilerplate, what most people would think of as a boilerplate agreement. So that's the standard agreement from that publisher for that particular imprint. So there may be certain things that have been modified specifically for that imprint, but these are the standard terms that go out. If you're working with an agent, chances are high that your agent has negotiated a special boilerplate with that particular publishing company, so that instead of handing out just their standard terms, they're going to hand you your agent's standard terms. Your agent's already negotiated certain things. And then you're really fine-tuning during the negotiation to make sure that it fits you. But they're going to send out something that is generic. And they're going to send it out without modifying it substantially because it is cheaper for them if you make changes than if they try to make it bespoke and perfect for you before they send it out. So it's really, it comes down to an efficiency thing. And the other thing is that from a negotiating perspective, it's better for them because if you don't ask for certain changes, they don't have to make them. Where I always tell people one of my many jobs before this was I managed all the IT contracts for a medium-sized company. So hardware, software, professional services. And in our professional services agreement, for information technology services, there was a section where the contractor would promise that they would carry insurance to operate a helicopter. That was in there because this was the standard agreement for services for this company. And one of the services that they bought on a semi-regular basis was helicopter operators to go out and check power lines. I had full authority to remove that section if somebody asked me to remove it. I had no authority to send the contract out without that term in it. So one of the ways that I would know whether or not a contractor had actually read the contract carefully is if they asked me, hey, there's this thing in here about carrying insurance to operate a helicopter? And I'd be like, oh yeah, totally. I can take that out. So sorry. But if they just signed it and turned it back to me, what I would usually do is go to the project manager and be like, hey, look out, because I'm pretty sure they did not read this carefully. So it might be that they're working too quickly to really know what it is that they're doing, and you might have to be on them a little bit more than you would somebody else. So that's the other thing, is don't feel bad about pushing back on a boilerplate agreement, because oftentimes the person who sent it to you knows full well that there are things in there that don't fit you and don't fit your situation, and they can do something about it if you ask for a change.
Yeah. Well, and Steven said sometimes they'll even see contracts where different elements contradict each other.
Yep. That happens a lot when somebody updates an agreement and they update part of it because of a particular problem, but they don't understand how it impacted this other section over here on page 3. So I see that occasionally. There are some contracts that I see a lot, and so I know them pretty well. And like I always know, like, there's going to be a typo on the top of page 4 in this paragraph because they've never fixed it. They only fix it when you ask them to. But it came from an editing error. They were cutting and pasting, and they forgot half of the sentence.
Now, as far as like so now you're a lawyer, so some creators might get a lawyer, some might get an agent, some might get both. What is the difference, first of all?
An agent is in a position where they are looking, I think of them as a really excellent matchmaker. So they understand the different publishers, and they understand the editors at those different publishing houses. And so they have a sense, based on your proposal, where this work is going to do best. And they're going to try to match you with the best editor and the best house to produce the book. And then they're going to try to negotiate the best deal for you based on what they know of that particular publisher's norms and how the industry is working at that particular moment. They tend to be much more like day to day in the culture of publishing. An attorney is more likely to help you just with making sure that the contract suits your needs. I occasionally actually work with agents where the agent knows what broad deal terms they want to get for the agreement. So they know the percentages, or they know the advance that they want, or they know we want to give them these rights, we don't want to give them these rights. And I will work with them to make sure that the rest of the contract is in the creator's best interest. So I'm looking to make sure of things like the conflict, there aren't any conflicts internally in the document, and the rights that they're asking for are reasonable when it comes to things like the warranties that you're making or the representations you're making about your work. So I'm really more focused on making sure that that document matches up with your expectations of what it's supposed to say, and that it has terms that are in your best interest. Whereas an agent it tends to be a longer relationship because they're not just focused on this particular deal. It really is, okay, what's the next project, and where are you going next, and who do you want to work with, and what are some long-term goals. That's just stuff that as an attorney I don't have the ability to do for my clients.
Yeah, and of course the way that you pay an agent is different from how you pay the attorney, right?
Totally, yeah. The agent's going to be taking a percentage of all the deals that they get for you, whereas an attorney, I get paid either based on my hourly fee, or sometimes I'll do flat fees. So a contract review is so much, and you know from the very beginning what you're going to spend.
Mm-hmm. Now, do you have any recommendations about how somebody who's just starting out can find and afford legal representation?
I think one of the things to do is, and this isn't legal representation necessarily, but talk to your peers, talk to the people that are in the industry, talk to folks that you respect, have conversations about what norms are. Because one of the easiest ways of protecting yourself is understanding what is normal. If you're looking at everything and judging it based only on what you know of the industry, you're going to get bit. But if you are reaching out to other professionals and having conversations and asking questions, you're more likely to be able to spot bad terms or bad deals. The other thing is that a lot of attorneys who work with comics professionals, like, we get it. We know that there aren't piles and piles of money hidden in comics. And so, like, I have a couple different friends who are attorneys and work with comics professionals, and we have, hourly rates. We try to have packages that are flat rates where, maybe I'm not doing as much work as I would do if I were representing you in the negotiation, but I'm doing enough so that you understand what the contract means and you have some guidance on what to do next. So don't be afraid of asking the attorney, like, what are your different options for being paid? What is your rate? Do you offer flat rates for things? Or to just tell them, like, my budget for this particular project is X. What can we do for that amount of money?
I see. Okay. Oh, another thing I heard you talk about on the other podcast was sometimes people will find a lawyer who maybe like a member of their family or something, but doesn't really work in publishing at all.
Yeah.
So that's kind of another, and there probably aren't all that. I mean, how many lawyers are there around the country who deal with this kind of contract?
There aren't a ton, but there are a number of us. And there have to be a number of us because sometimes, we can't represent people because we represented the other party at some other point in time. So there are definitely more folks that are doing it and getting the experience. But I would definitely, even if the person doesn't have explicit experience in comics, I would want to work with somebody who has experience in publishing. Or if they don't have experience in publishing, I would want them to at least have experience in licenses. So do they do intellectual property licenses? Because that person has more context for what to look out for than somebody who, like, it's very common for somebody to ask their dad's friend, and their dad's friend ends up being like a real estate attorney, which is a very different thing than a comic book. Or like I had one time where the person came in, she said that her dad's friend had tried to help her out, but he thought it was just a horrible agreement. And I said, "Oh, what does he do?" And he writes wills. So he was an estate planning attorney, which there's nothing wrong with that, but it's a fundamentally different thing. And there are things in comics agreements that wouldn't fly in other agreements, but that's because of the industry and what the industry has decided is normal. And if you invest all of your attorney energy in fixing those things that are industry norms that you just don't know of, you're limiting your ability to get better terms in the other places where, maybe you can have a positive impact for the client and get them some better tools to work with if things go wrong.
But since, there's not necessarily a lawyer experienced in publishing contracts in every city, so do you have to travel a lot for your work or talk to clients on Skype a lot? Or
I do end up using Skype a lot to talk to folks. Lawyers and licensing is a little bit weird. So generally speaking, a lawyer is licensed to practice in a certain state, and they tend to work with clients in that state. I work with folks all over the place as long as I can feel confident that the advice that I am giving them is advice that I am licensed to give them. So I will assess it on a case-by-case basis. But, I would ask your friends who they use. Have you ever worked with an attorney? Did you like working with them? That is the best referral you can possibly get. Because that is a human being that you can ask questions of and say, like, okay, what did you like? What did you not like? The other thing is, pay attention when people are talking about their lawyers or their representation online. Who's being mentioned? I see lots of different. In fact, that's how I have met some of my friends who are attorneys in comics, is because I saw somebody say, "Oh, big thanks to my lawyer Thomas. He really helped me with this deal." And I'm like, "Oh, who's Thomas? Oh, there's Thomas. He's responding to this. I'm gonna be friends with him. I'm gonna find out who he is." So pay attention to who people are talking about, and then when you find an attorney, don't be hesitant to just interview them the way you would somebody that you were hiring to work for you, because that's exactly what you're doing. And ask them, what kind of experience do you have working with contracts? What kind of experience do you have with comics or publishing or licensing agreements? Is this something that you feel that you can manage for me? And if not, do you have a recommendation of somebody else I should talk to?
Now, in your work, have you ever encountered a creator who had an agent that wasn't necessarily doing a good job of looking out for the client's interests? Steve was asking about, I'm quoting him here.
Sure.
Aren't agents who extend multiple services to clients, representing creative work to publishers for publication while acting as creative doctors, shaping material for sale, while presenting themselves as also providing legal representation to their clients, aren't they inherently presenting multiple conflicts of interest, self-interest, in doing so?
There are rules about whether or not you can be an agent and an attorney at the same time, and they're different in different states. So, yes, some states think there is an inherent conflict. Others do not. So part of it depends on where that particular agent is. There are a lot of agents that have a legal background. They get tired of being lawyers, and agenting seems to be a lot of fun. But every agent has a different approach. And I don't necessarily think an agent who is actively involved in shaping the material is bad, but if that's not the help that you're looking for, then that's not the right agent for you. And it's okay for you to say, like, here's this agent, they work really, really well for all of these people and they seem perfectly happy, but it's not the right agent for me, because the services that they are providing are not the services that I was hoping to get. I was hoping to get somebody who could really advise me on my career, my plan, or I was really hoping to work with somebody who can help me break into children's books. Those are very different people. And if you just hire the person that's shiny and shows up without asking questions, it's possible that you're going to have a bad match. But I do get squirmy when somebody is doing all the things for a creator and trying to control a whole lot more than just getting deals and making things happen so that they can work, because that to me is somebody who doesn't have good boundaries. And if they don't have good boundaries about that, they're probably not going to have really great boundaries about about their relationship. Again, that works for some people, and that's totally fine. But I always encourage people, before you hire an agent or a manager or a lawyer, ask them who some of their other clients are. And then, if possible, talk to those people and just get a sense of what's your experience been like? What do you like about working with them? What do you wish was different? Here are my goals for working with a professional like that. Do you think this would be the right person for those goals?
Okay. Some people might have both a lawyer and an agent. They don't necessarily need to have both, but how important would you say it is to have at least one of those two for, a new creator?
Very, very, a lot, a whole bunch, extremely good. I do think you need somebody who can advise you, who can look at it from your perspective, understand what your goals are, understand what your interests are, and tell you, yes, this is good, or no, this is bad. I do think that is helpful. I understand that, practically speaking, there are people that aren't in a position to hire an attorney and they don't have an agent. But if you are entertaining an offer from a bigger publishing house, so I'm not talking about like an independent comics publisher is a little bit different. But if you're, like Random House wants to publish your graphic novel, if you can't afford an attorney and you don't have an agent at that point in time, the secret is you can have an agent really, really quickly. because your query to the agent is no longer, I have this book I want to sell. Your query is, I have this book that I have an offer for and I need help with. And so that is a much better deal for the agent, because they know the place for this book, that work has already been done. Now we're really making sure that the agreement, that the purchase works for my client. So if you get an offer, take some time, reach out to some agents, and see if you can get representation, because chances are you can, and that way you at least know that you have somebody who is advising you and who is solidly in your corner. They don't have other interests at play.
Okay. Oh, one other thing I wanted to hear you talk about here, that you talked about on the other podcast, about deal memos versus actual contracts, and when is a good time to get in touch with a lawyer.
So a deal memo is basically like a high-level summary of what the contract will be, and they tend to have the points of the deal that are most interesting to us, right? Like, it's going to have information about money, about percentages for royalties. It's going to have information about like the different types of rights that are in play, but it's not going to get granular. The problem that I see is somebody will get that deal memo. They don't have an agent. They don't have an attorney. They like what the deal memo says. They say, okay, send me the contract. And then they go out and they call me and they say, hey, Katie, can you help me with this contract? Well, once you've agreed to the deal memo, it is very hard, if not impossible, to change those terms. So I can change the legal terms that might not be in your favor, but as far as negotiating a overall package that works well for you, there are certain things that you've already agreed to that are off the table at this point. So I actually think it's better to get somebody involved when that offer comes, because then they can look at the offer and say, you know what, this is a pretty low royalty percentage for the type of book that you're selling. That doesn't quite meet industry norms. So I want to go back and ask the editor where this is coming from. Because they might have a perfectly good reason. Usually they do have a reason. But that's not something, if you're relatively inexperienced, that you would be able to tell from looking at the deal memo. That's really something that somebody who has done a lot of publishing agreements is going to be able to notice.
I suppose the creator might not start thinking, I need a lawyer, until they see something written in legalese.
Totally.
Right.
And that's completely understandable. Like, I get it. Deal memo does not say lawyer. Contract says lawyer. But if you think about the deal memo as agreeing to the outline of the agreement, and that, you want somebody to help make sure that outline is solid, it has the things that you need and are going to be important to you. The other thing is, when I think about negotiating a contract, I think about like being in front of a huge switchboard, and I can push buttons and flip switches and make connections, and it's going to have an impact somewhere else in the agreement. If I have at my disposal as many switches and buttons and connections as possible, I have a lot more flexibility in how I negotiate that deal. But if there are certain things that are set in stone and off limits, I am just limited in what I can do with the rest of the negotiation. It's not bad necessarily. It just means I can't make certain connections. I can't flip certain switches, and so I'm gonna be more limited in what I can offer.
All right. Well, this has been really good. Nice to talk to you.
Yeah, it's lovely talking to you too. Thanks for inviting me to chat.
Well, yeah. Thanks for coming on. Okay. And how can people find out more or get in touch with you? I understand you also have a kind of automated online course.
Yeah, I have. So I'm on Twitter, although not as often recently. I'm on Twitter. It's just my _Katie_Lane is my handle there. My website is workmadeforhire.net, and if you go there, you should be able to sign up for my my newsletter, which would give you a couple different options for. I have some email-based courses to help you learn publishing agreements and help you learn how to read contracts. I'm also starting a series of classes on Skillshare, if you're a Skillshare member, on contracts for creative freelancers. So I'm digging into the guts of creative service agreements and focusing on particular issues one lesson at a time to help you feel better prepared when you're looking at contracts that people are giving you for your work.
Once again, Katie's website is workmadeforhire.net. Here at deconstructingcomics.com, we produce Deconstructing Comics, Critiquing Comics, and To the Bat Pulls. If you like our shows and want to support them, pledge at patreon.com/deconcomics. Also, please help us get noticed by reviewing us on Apple or at any other podcast source. Tell the world why you enjoy Deconstructing Comics. Another way to show your appreciation is simply to write to us. Email us at mail@deconstructingcomics.com or contact us through social media. Find all the links on the right sidebar at deconstructingcomics.com. We're also on the Comics Podcast Network at comicspodcasts.com and on comiccon.com, where our new episodes usually go up on the Friday before they appear in our feed. Our theme is from bensound.com. If you're looking for some constructive feedback on your comic, send it to us and Mulele and I will critique it on our spin-off podcast, Critiquing Comics. Send it to mail@deconstructingcomics.com. We'll read at least 30 pages of it and critique it on the show. We're on summer vacation for a few weeks, but we'll be back in August, so send in your comic now. Last Thursday on To the Bat Pulls, we discussed Peggy Shaw's unmade Catwoman script, Fashions in Crime. We talk about the comic story from the 1940s that inspired the script, and the possible reasons the script was ultimately not used. But the story of this script itself has a surprise ending. Listen to the Bat Pulls in its own podcast feed on Apple Podcasts or other podcast apps, or at tothebatpulls.libsyn.com. Then next week, my interview with Mike Barron, co-creator of Nexus and Badger, and he's written a lot of other mainstream and indie comics and several horror novels as well. So be here next week. Till then, this is Tim, and thanks for listening to Deconstructing Comics.